Hello and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Alexander Sebrenic about social aspects of software engineering. But before I start, I want to ask you for a small favor. If you enjoy this podcast, could you please share it with a friend or two? Just send them this episode or the link to the podcast website. This would really help me to grow the podcast and ensure I can keep spending so much time on producing new episodes for you. So thank you a lot, and now back to Alexander. Alexander is a full professor of social software engineering at Eindhoven University in the Netherlands. Alexander's research goal is to facilitate evolution of software by taking into account social aspects of software development. So I'm super thrilled to have him on my podcast today. So welcome, Alexander. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Michaela. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me to talk to you about, my favorite subject.
Yeah, that's so cool. So you sent me a couple of papers. You have plenty of papers, so people should really check them out. But one really struck my attention, right? It was called Emotions and Perceived Productivity of Software Developers at Workplace. And maybe I'm very inclined to talk about this paper because I was working on productivity, perceived productivity, and developer experience. How do developer experience their work environment, and how does this influence their productivity for the last couple of years? So I'm super interested to hear what this paper is about and what you found out. So can you maybe give us a little summary of the paper, and also why do you look at perceived productivity of software developers? Why is that interesting?
Well, let us start looking at the entire story of emotions, right? So, of course, we know that people experience emotions, and we also know that emotions influence cognitive processes, such as problem solving, and also influence how people collaborate with each other. And this is exactly what software engineering is about. It is a collaborative problem solving. So if you want to talk about increasing productivity, if you want to think about improving collaboration, we need to understand what emotions people feel when they are working together or when they are performing programming tasks. So for several years, and I, sometimes independently and sometimes together, have been trying to understand emotion as expressed in, for instance, code review comments or in Stack Overflow questions. But of course, emotion is expressed. It's not necessarily emotion as experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So to get further insight in emotions as experienced, we wanted to go for more direct measurement for biometrics.
Can you outline a little bit more what's the difference between expressed emotions and experienced emotions? How do you draw the line here? How can we understand it, as we are not that familiar with emotions and the research behind emotions?
Well, there are all kinds of theories that explain how emotions exactly are being expressed, but roughly speaking, we need to understand that not everything we feel we express in general, and in particular in the professional setting. Norms of professional behavior restrict the way emotion is expressed, or sometimes force it to amplify.
Mm-hmm.
If you are thinking about things like codes of conduct will typically say don't be a jerk and welcome newcomers and so on and so on. But if I'm an experienced software developer and I don't care about those newcomers, I'm not going to be as excited, as welcoming as maybe this kind of norms of behavior expect me to be. So I will be amplifying something which I do not necessarily feel as strongly as expected. And on the other hand, of course, I might feel frustrated, but I might be required to tune down those emotions such as that I do not offend my colleagues.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this is an intuitive difference between what you feel and how do you express it. So of course we can ask people, how do you feel? And we hope that during the experiment people will be more open about what they feel as opposed to the real workplace environment. But of course, going even deeper to the hardware level would be even cooler. So this work actually has started with the work of Nicole Novielli and her team, Filippo Lanobile and Daniela Girardi. So they have conducted a controlled experiment with several students. So the students have been asked to perform a certain programming task, and they've been interrupted on a regular occasions to measure their biometrics. Biometrics, think about heartbeat, think about skin response. So if you are stressed, then you are starting to sweat a little bit. It doesn't mean that, the entire environment is suffering because of it, but the conductivity of your skin changes and sensors can actually measure it and see it as a reflection of stress. And then, of course, you can compare it to emotion as reported by the students.
Mm-hmm.
So this was an interesting work. They have successfully built a machine learning classifier that succeeded to predict emotion according to those biometric signals. But of course, those were students, and it was only 1 hour. So it
Mm-hmm.
was a controlled experiment. And as any controlled experiment, it is not necessarily representative for the real world. And so in the paper you have mentioned, we have actually went to this real world and tried to see how this kind of questions can be answered on the workplace. So we have contacted 5 Dutch companies, small companies, large companies, and we've been extremely lucky for them to agree to participate. Agreeing to participate meant that several of their employees had to wear the wristband for 2 or 3 weeks. So all those
Oh,
companies
wow.
have been using some kind of agile methodology, and this was sprint. So as you can imagine, wearing this wristband for 2 or 3 weeks required quite a significant commitment. I mean, it was not harmful in a sense; it's just a wristband. It's not that it makes you, it hurts you in some way. But of course, you need to remember to turn it on, to turn it off, to download the biometric signals on certain moments, and so on and so on. So we have been very, very lucky to get this information. And in addition to this biometrics, we have been also asking people to report how they feel and what makes them feel in terms of what triggers their positive or negative emotions they are feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we also asked about perceived productivity. Again, we are stressing the word perceived because productivity, as Michaela, as a productivity expert, definitely knows, can be operationalized in many different ways, and perception is only one of them. So ultimately, what have we figured out? When it comes to what makes people happy or unhappy, so we have seen things which are related to the individuals themselves. For instance, feeling in a flow triggers positive emotions, as opposed to being stuck, which triggers negative emotions. But we have also seen that positive emotions are typically associated with collaboration, at least when collaboration goes well, and also breaks, just taking regular breaks and understanding, this is a work time and this is a not work time, helps developers. When it comes to negative emotions, we have seen that typical challenges are related to problems of mapping behavior to cause, right? So this frustrating situations when you see that the system does not work and you have no idea why. So essentially figuring out the root cause of the problem is one of the most frustrating experiences, and developers report negative emotions associated with it. And of course, we have things you would probably expect, like time pressure, like unconstructive meetings, and so on and so forth. By the way, constructive meetings actually trigger positive emotion. So it's not true that all the meetings are horrible and that software developers just hate them because they are meetings. Meetings can be constructive and then triggering positive emotions. Meetings can be not constructive, not productive, and then they trigger negative emotions.
Can I ask you about the positive
Sure.
emotions? So I understand that, for example, negative emotions we would detect with these sensors by sweating, for example, right? Or the heart rate goes up. But how do you detect positive emotions? Is it just not negative emotions, or is it really, is there a neutral and then there is a positive reaction of your body? How would you measure that in my biometric sense?
Well, it's not that we directly link stress to negative emotion, or it's essentially you are measuring the same things, right? You are measuring certain biometric signals and then you are mapping them to valence, arousal, and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty much the same. Whatever you are measuring, indeed different. You are indeed predicting different categories. You are predicting high valence, low valence, and so on. That's how it works, right?
Mm.
When you are trying to connect it to productivity, then it seems that indeed valence, so positive versus negative, is the most important predictor, which explains up to 12%, which is kind of a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And what's also interesting is that there is an interaction of valence and time. Essentially, it means that at the end of the day, in the second half of the day, your emotion is more likely to affect your productivity.
Okay.
And this is essentially related to fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
right? So fatigue reduces control, and this means that your emotion is more directly connected to productivity.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a little bit more about this link and how you looked at it between productivity and emotion? So it's perceived productivity, so how productive do I feel, right? It's not really how
Yes.
actual productive I am, or it's not how many tasks, it's really how productive do I feel. Do I feel like I get a lot done, or do I feel like, oh, I'm a little bit stuck? So I would probably tell you that on some Likert scale, right? Some, I feel very productive or very unproductive. And then you're also asking me about my emotions. So I would say, oh, I'm very stressed. And then you look at the link, whether or not probably negative. So the hypothesis will probably be that negative emotions reduce your perceived productivity. So if I have anxiety or if I'm stressed, I feel less productive. And if I'm, let's say, relaxed or happy, I feel more productive. Is that how the
Roughly,
setup
yes,
was?
right? So productivity is indeed on a Likert scale from very low to very high, and we operationalize emotions through the so-called VAD model, which is essentially valence, arousal, and dominance. And valence is indeed this positive negative from annoyed to pleased. Arousal is from calm to excited, and dominance from control to controlling.
Hmm.
Those are the three dimensions of emotions. There are different operationalizations of emotions. This is the one we use here. And when I said that valence is the most important predictor, essentially it says that when people are more positive, then they are feeling more productive.
Hmm.
Of course, it's a simplified thing because there is more to it than only valence, but it still explains you 12% of your variance. So it's quite important. As opposed to it, for instance, arousal will explain only roughly 3% of your variance, right? So arousal ranging from calm to excited. More excited you are, you might be inclined to think that you are more productive, but essentially it explains only a small part of this productivity.
Okay. And so you were talking about that we are fatigued. And then you also mentioned a little bit earlier that breaks, you could see that taking breaks actually increases your perceived productivity, which I think is similar, right? So being fatigued, and then what can you do for, reversing that? You're going on a break. So how did you measure that, or what were some instances that you saw? Did people go for a lunch break, or did they go for stretching? Do you have some insights into that? What kind of breaks do we have to take to increase our productivity, our
Uh,
also our
so
well-being, probably?
Yeah, so essentially, we did not connect breaks so directly to productivity. We connected breaks to emotions, to triggers of emotions, and then they are indirectly, of course, related to productivity, as we just discussed.
Mhm.
So when it comes to breaks, we talked about individual breaks and we talked about social breaks, for instance, lunch or taking rest. So we have also separated our day into morning and afternoon. So when we're talking about this fatigue, right? Based on the lunch break. So essentially, before the lunch break, after the lunch break. In one of the companies which we have observed, they have this tradition of going for a walk during the lunch break. So they seem to be very excited about their lunch breaks.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lunch break is an interesting probably, and here we are probably going a little bit into speculation. But I can imagine that if you have a lunch break that's very heavy, that you're actually more fatigued afterwards because of, your digestive system and so on. Like, I definitely recall some of my lunch breaks, and then I changed them when I felt like, oh my God, I can't work now, right? So I don't feel very productive, even though I have been on a break right now. And then, as you said, as I changed a little bit the lunches that I took, like smaller meals or adding some exercises. So when I was working in the Netherlands in the university, we walked up to the eighth floor right after lunch. It helped a little bit, right? Getting your system back on track and so on. So have you seen that maybe directly in the study, or did you get some insights into that?
Not directly into the study, but there is, of course, a separate line of research by Thomas Fritz and
Mm-hmm.
back then Manuela Ziegler on interruptions, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of interruptions? When can you interrupt people? When you cannot interrupt people? Most of the time, interruptions are being seen as something negative, right? You are working, you don't want to be interrupted. But discussion makes me think that maybe we need to be more careful in this discussion of interruptions and see them as something which can be positive as well. Going for coffee can help you not only to catch up on the local rumors, but maybe also to switch off your brain from solving a very technical problem. Or
Yeah.
maybe you can actually talk about the problem to some other colleagues who are also waiting for the coffee and find a solution together.
Yeah,
So
I
this
think
actually
anecdotally, right? Anecdotally, there were many stories that I hear where people say, "Oh, I was stuck and I couldn't figure out, and I was there doing it, I don't know, debugging for 2 hours, and then I took a small break, came back, and right there in front of me lies the problem, crystal clear." I think I've heard at least stories like that quite frequently.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also think now about the work of Pedro Teguero. I don't know whether she has already been on your podcast. If not, please consider inviting her. She's
Hmm.
doing very cool things. So one of the things she was doing, she was looking for how people ask for help. And essentially asking for help is a major challenge for software developers, she was observing, mostly because people feel uncomfortable interrupting more senior colleagues with their questions that they themselves might find not meriting the interruption. So from this perspective, I do wonder whether this kind of coffee breaks can help to reduce the social anxiety which is involved in asking for help.
Hmm.
Because right? So maybe it's kind of easier to talk to people. And also reminds me, of course, the scientific conferences, which you are, of course, familiar with, right? When you have more junior people who do not really dare to talk to more senior people unless there is someone who would be ready to introduce them. So there is a certain discomfort here, which might also play a role even in software companies when
Yeah.
people are supposed to know each other.
Yeah. So, Alexander, you were studying emotions not only in that paper or in this study, but in many, many different studies. And you already talked a little bit about it, also emotions and code reviews, for example, right? We can look at the code review comments and we can, try to figure out whether or not it's a positive comment or a negative comment, if we are a little bit angry, frustrated, or happy, and so on. So, what's your experience with emotions in code reviews? Can we detect them? Do we see them? Do
Uh, we,
people try
we
not to share them?
We do see them. They are different in a sense that, of course, the norms of professional behavior prevent people from expressing some emotions, but not always. One of the more commonly seen phenomena we have observed is the phenomenon of confusion. We can wonder whether confusion is strictly speaking an emotion or not, because it's more cognitive state than affective state. But we do see people getting frustrated because they are confused.
Mm,
And confusion is, of course, a painful issue because if I, as a reviewer, am confused what the source code is doing, I might be tempted to approve it, essentially relying on the developer having done their job. And obviously, in a symmetric way, if I'm a developer and if I'm confused about something that some other code is doing, I will just assume that it's doing something reasonable and hope that the reviewer will catch my mistake. So
mhm,
this confusion is essentially related to mistakes passing through this kind of quality gates.
mhm.
So we've been looking at confusion quite extensively. We've been surveying people. We have been mining data from repositories on GitHub. And indeed, you see a whole bunch of issues. And the most common problem which is triggering confusion in relation to artifacts is essentially missing rationale. Developers are not understanding why certain things are being done. And this brings, of course, opens an entire direction of, can we find some kind of knowledge in previous discussions or in some other kind of documents or some other kind of artifacts which might be present. Because
Okay.
if we cannot rely upon developers to actually comment, to explicitly state this rationale, then we need to find a way to mine it in some way.
hmm And so, how did you? What are some of the patterns that you detect to detect confusion? Is it that they are asking a lot of questions, or is it that there's a long discussion going on, or what are How do you detect confusion in code reviews?
So we have been lucky in a sense that we have reused a theoretical model of confusion, which has not been designed for software engineering, but has been designed for human communication in general. And it has several textual cues which can be used to identify confusion. Indeed, some of them are related to asking questions. So in any case, there is a theoretical model of Michel Jordan which defines it as situations when individuals have a sense of wondering, doubt, or unease about
hmm
how the future will unfold, what the present means, or how to interpret the past. So this was essentially the theoretical model we have used, and based on this model, we have mixed automatic detection of certain keywords with manual labeling of the confusing or non-confusing code review comments.
hmm
And on top of it, we have also conducted a survey asking people when do they feel confused, what usually makes them confused, can they describe a change for code change that, for instance, has confused them, and so on. And so, based on this kind of questions, we have obtained more examples of confusing situations and whatever we would have been able to detect directly by observing code review comments.
Yeah. So what I was wondering as well is code review comments, especially the ones that we are talking about, they are written, right? It's in a written format. It's also what you are analyzing, right? It's hard
Right.
to analyze if we are doing a synchronous code review and we're just speaking, right? So what you probably focus on, and I think what the majority of people are doing when they're doing code reviews is they're writing each other comments and it's text based. And in my experience and also research shows that written communication is quite different from verbal communication. A lot of things are missing, like social clues are missing, facial expressions are missing, body language, right? So code reviews or code review comments tend to create more misunderstandings, I think, than if we are talking to each other face to face. I expect, or I think that it has also to do that we are confronted with this computer, right? With this interface. We are actually working with a program and not really talking to a person, right? So it's hard to, there's another level of, oh, actually, I'm talking to another person with this, right? By writing down my comments. Have you looked at that as well? And do you see that comments maybe they seem to be offensive, but they are not meant in an offensive way, or that they seem that there is miscommunication or misinterpretation happening? Have you studied that a little bit, or has that impacted your work in some way?
Well, thank you very much for this question. So, of course, computer mediated communication is different from direct communication, even if you are talking about talking face to face, right? So, this conversation we are having now might have looked differently if you would have been in the same physical space.
Mhm.
On top of this, as you are correctly pointing out, we have this relatively poor communication channel, right? So, it's just text in the most fancy way. It can include emojis, but this is more or less it, right? I would not dare to say that it causes more confusion. It's tricky. Usually, when we are in the same space, we are also in the same time, in a sense that you need to decide now whether this is good or bad. Well, of course, if you are separate, then you can take your time, ideally, and try to figure out whether this change is actually okay or not. So I would not necessarily be advocating for joint code review, essentially sitting together, because then it kind of becomes a pair programming, right? It becomes a different kind of working. It's not that
Mhm.
it's better or worse. It's just a different kind of working. So when it comes specifically to misunderstanding and to intentions, yes, this is of course a very important thing. Part of the confusion is understanding of the communication intention. This is not always easy. And we have actually seen on several occasions that communication intention was the reason for confusion in our study.
Mhm.
Just to give you an example, different communication intention as opposed to the face value of it. Let's forget for a second about our software developers. But when the police officer tells you, "Can I see your ID, please?" It's not a question that you can answer with the answer yes or no, right? I
It's
mean, even
rhetorical.
so
Yes.
grammatically, right, it is. It's a request for action.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an information request. It's not a confirmation request, right? It's a request for action which is being expressed as a question as for the sake of politeness. And this is also what we see in communication between developers. Questions are often used to soften the negative message or to request an action. Could you please do something, something? Most of the time, it actually means you should do something, something, rather than asking for an opinion whether you actually could do it.
Yeah.
So this is a matter of communication intention. Another topic you are touching upon is hurting someone's feelings, right? This is related to the matter of toxicity, which is an important topic both societally and in software engineering research. You might know that Bogdan Vasilescu has published on this topic recently. You might know some work of Bram Adams in this space. So there are quite some people who are working on toxicity. And indeed, toxicity is a problematic matter partially because of its intersection with cultural expectations. Linus Torvalds, very well known example, has argued very often that his use of expletives is essentially a Finnish management culture,
Mm-hmm.
at least part of the Finnish management culture. So this is tricky because to some extent there are cultural differences which might explain interpretation of a certain text or interpretation of a certain behavior as toxic or not toxic. But at the same time, you cannot claim that everything can be attributed to cultural differences because this would kind of mean that everything goes, which clearly is not the case. So this is a difficult matter, right? Where do you draw the line? And it is difficult for human beings, and it's of course even more difficult for any kind of automated tools which might be used to detect negative behavior, such toxic behavior. There are several bots. If you are looking around on GitHub, you will find several toxicity detectors. The problem is that many of them are based on dictionaries, and the moment people figure out that those tools are based on dictionaries, it will start replacing characters and playing all kinds of tricks just to pacify the tool, which is
Yeah.
essentially not really solving the problem. Another issue is that, of course, toxicity and emotion are related but not the same. You can have a very negative and very toxic comments, and we have seen them. However, you can have a much more subtle behavior, which would be still toxic, but would not necessarily express negative emotion. So those things are related, but they're not the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder also about the thing that you said at the beginning, right? Intention, because this is something that comes up in my workshop quite a bit, right? When I'm working even on people on how to give feedback, how to respond to feedback. And you said, well, a lot of people ask questions, even though it's not a question, right? So could you maybe change that, right? So we really make it very subtle with the could and then maybe. Um, but in reality it's a I want you to change that, right? I want you to make actually take an action, as you said, right? What do you think, how should people work with that? What's your opinion on it? Should they just say, please go ahead and change that, or are questions actually valid way to express that because it's more polite? What's your perspective on that?
Well, here I'm mostly looking at the way I tend to communicate with my co-authors when I'm reviewing papers typically written by students. rather than actually, with my scientific perspective on how software developers are doing it.
Hmm.
It really, really depends on whom you are talking to. In some cases, asking questions is a perfectly valid strategy. In some cases, you should be more direct. It really depends on your relation with the person to whom you are giving this feedback. It's hard to say, like, it also depends on the situation, right? Of course, when you are asking a question, you are kind of leaving space for the other party to say no.
Yeah,
If this feedback is so important for you, then you might consider reiterating this point in a more explicit way,
yeah,
even after the person has said no.
yeah,
But I still think that you should. If this is something you kind of suggest, but don't necessarily want to fight for, then you'll just leave it
yeah.
first.
Yeah, pick your petals. So, when you did all this work on emotions, also how people interact, the social aspects of engineers, what's your advice for my listeners who are, a large portion of it are software engineers? What's your advice for them to, make collaboration better, improve their productivity, improve their emotions, make their work life better? What are some of the key aspects that they should, consider or keep in mind?
Well, I think that I will stick to a quite generic statement. Keep in mind that you are a human being. This
Hmm.
means that keep in mind that you have emotions and keep in mind that other people have emotions. And that when you are phrasing things, in particular in such a poor channel as code review text comments, be aware that your comments should or might be misinterpreted. So try not to harm feelings. Try to be explicit about what you want, but try not to be harm feelings. And beyond that, take breaks.
I like the take the breaks thing. I think they're so important. Breaks are really important. I think it's so important to have, this flow state, which means really less interruptions, turn off your notifications for your emails. Just, look at your emails every 2 hours or maybe just at lunch and, before you go home, something like this. But then on the other hand, take breaks. I think this is such an important message. And I really like that research is also, pointing into that direction, saying we should really take our breaks. Yeah.
We need to be very careful as not to create a rat race. Unfortunately, we know we are getting more and more studies which reveal highly problematic behavior. You might have known there is a recent paper about drug use of software developers. We know from our own studies that older software developers being pushed out of the field, and as a way to counteract that, some of them are adopting useful patterns of behavior, which might range from working extra hours to adjusting slash lying on your CV, for instance, by hiding previous employment, to undergoing plastic surgery.
Hmm.
So this kind of things, or to taking performance enhancing
Drugs. Yeah.
things, right? So
Mm.
we need to be careful with this, because not allowing yourself to be human makes us machines, and machines are supposed to be productive for the sake of productivity and not for the. I mean, there is no real thing like well-being of a machine, and this is essentially a very, very dangerous trend.
Yeah. And there are also papers around the pandemic and how the pandemic also increased overworking, increased productivity, well, for the sake of, decreased well-being and decreased work-life balance. So yeah, I definitely see that this is a hot topic. And I think with the working from home movement, which I really like working from home, but I think it's even harder to set your boundaries, right? And say, well, I'm out of office right now. I don't watch my emails. I'm not on call right now, right? And yeah, and really making sure that even though maybe I can take a break in the afternoon, I don't have to completely overcompensate for that, right? Like having over hours and working much more. Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? So the pandemic papers seem to suggest that there is a separation between people who can handle it and people who cannot
Mm.
handle. And there are many, many reasons why some people can and why some people cannot. But for instance, a Brazilian study has shown that one of the variables is gender. Their study has clearly indicated that women had much harder time dealing with the pandemic way of working than men. And this was partially related to the fact that the needs were different. So men were typically complaining about environmental, like noise. Women have been mostly complaining about the fact that they need to combine their working from home with homeschooling of their kids because the schools have been closed, and so on and so forth. And then it also turned out that it's not only that the needs were different, but that also the abilities of companies to meet those needs were very different. Of course, as a company, it is much easier for you to give your employee noise canceling headset or an ergonomic chair rather than to throw away the entire schedule of meetings and reviews to accommodate for homeschooling of the kids. So essentially,
Yeah.
this study has shown yet again that in case of stress, and the pandemic is obviously a situation of stress, people who are disadvantaged under normal conditions are becoming even more disadvantaged under stressful conditions. And in this case, it was clearly the case for women in Brazil.
Yeah, I think it was probably not only in Brazil, it was in so many countries, right?
Yeah, that the
I mean,
study
this
was
is the
Brazilian, so
study.
that's why
Yeah,
I'm trying to be careful with
I
generalizations.
know, I know. Yeah. Well, Alexander, thank you so much for being on my show today, talking with me about all those social aspects of software engineering. And yeah, thank you so much. I will definitely link your papers in the show notes and your website. Is there something else that comes to your mind that you want to share with them?
I can just say that the topics of human aspects or collaborative aspects of software engineering are very close to my heart. So if some of your listeners want to talk to me or want to participate in some of our studies or want to ask any kind of questions, they can always contact me via Twitter, via email, or in any other means. And it will be my pleasure to answer any questions that your listeners might have.
Yeah, thank you so much. Cool. I will link everything in the show notes. So thank you, Alexander, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Goodbye.
Bye bye. This was another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please help me spread the word about the podcast. Send the episode to a friend via email, Twitter, LinkedIn, well, whatever messaging system you use, or give it a positive review on your favorite podcasting platforms such as Spotify or iTunes. This would mean really a lot to me. So, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.